Very good. Well, it's good to be here, everyone. My wife and I flew into Philadelphia on Saturday, and so we've been kind of touring around the East Coast a little bit. Very much enjoy our time here, beautiful area that you have. So we're excited to be here. Glad to be a part of this conference. Like Jen said, we do farm in Nebraska. We are pretty much smack in the middle. If you could put a pinpoint in the exact center of the 48 continental United States, it would be about 30 miles straight south of where we live. So we're just pretty much right in the exact center of the continental United States. We have been no-tilling for over 25 years. We are 2/3 dry land, 1/3 irrigated. Corn, beans, cereal is kind of a typical dry land rotation. Corn, beans only would be the typical irrigated rotation. But we have, over the last several years, added some of these other crops to what we grow because partly because we wanted to have the extra diversity, and also partly because we can sell them through our cover crop seed business. Because 8 years ago, we started a business called Green Cover Seed, and basically that picture that you see there, in 2011, that was all farm ground. That's all been built since 2011 in response to the need within the cover crop seed industry. And so it's grown very quickly. It's been a challenge to keep up, but we've sure learned a heck of a lot in doing this. And last year, we were very, very blessed and fortunate. The Soil Health Institute is putting together a soil health documentary, which is going to be coming out. They hope to get some PBS air coverage on it, maybe even. But they're putting out this Living Soil series, and it's going to be this documentary. So they asked us if we would be a part of it. We were very honored to do that. And so we said, yeah, we'd love to do that. So part of what they wanted to do with this video is they wanted to get a picture of us with the combine running in the cornfield and then seeding the cover crop right behind it, because one of the things that we preach is, have living roots in the ground as much as possible and always keep the soil covered. So that was the whole premise here. So they came out in a beautiful October fall afternoon, and I just they sent this drone out. We've never had anybody film us with the drone, but it's really cool. I just want to show you this video here. Okay, so here it was. I had the hired man, went and hooked up the air seeder, and I jumped in and took off to the field. It's a beautiful day. I'm thinking, man, this is going to be great. I'm going to be in this soil health documentary. We're going to be movie stars in this deal. And so I jump in and take off down the road and start bringing her up to speed, just thinking how cool this is. And just about the time you think everything's really going well, the wheels literally fall off the wagon. So I show that partly because I want to verify that I'm a real farmer. Bad things happen to us too, and I would almost guarantee any farmer in the room has done something like this, but nobody, I bet, has it captured on high definition. Now they promised me this would not be part of the documentary, but it might be part of the bloopers at the end, perhaps. So sometimes pride goes before a fail. So I want to start my talk with this slide because, I'm from Nebraska. You guys here in Delaware on the East Coast, what do I have that you could learn from? Well, I like to share this slide because, as Emerson tells us, as to methods, there may be a million and then some. The principles are few. And the man who can grasp the principles, you can select your own methods. But if you try my methods on your farms, you're sure to fail. So listen for the principles that I'm going to share, that Mike is going to share, because the principles are the same whether we're in Nebraska or Missouri or in Delaware. The methods that you use to implement those principles, you're going to have to figure those out yourself. And just in visiting with some of you and driving around, there's a lot of good people already figuring a lot of that out. So what I'm going to do this morning is I want to try to teach you in kind of a quick, big picture, broad overview of one of the most complex systems in the world, and that's this whole system of the soil and all of the complex interactions that are going on inside of it. I'm going to do it by comparing it to an equally complex system, but one we're more familiar with, and that's the economy of a country. because what's going on in the soil has so many parallels to what goes on within the economy of a country. And if you remember back from your high school or college econ class, there's 7 basic principles of an economy. And I'm going to just real quickly go through each one of these, and then we'll apply these to the soil and what's going on inside the soil. So the first principle of economy is supply. You can't have an economy if you're not growing something, if you're not producing something. You have to have something that you can sell. So strong economies are very productive. And a high percentage of all the entities within that economy are producing something, they're selling something, and diversity is very important. And I'm going to say that over and over here again today, because regardless of what you're doing, diversity is always important, because if you're only producing one thing, you're very susceptible to the market. And the second thing is you have to have demand. It does you no good to produce something if you can't sell it. It does no good to supply something if nobody wants to buy it. So strong economies have a high demand for products as well. Economies are strongest when the majority of entities are both producing and demanding, supplying and demanding. And again, diversity is very important. And then we have currency. Currency is what allows these transactions to happen between producers and consumers. And so with a good currency, it allows the economy to be very efficient. It allows these exchanges and transactions to happen. It needs to be universally desired and accepted, and it needs to have different forms and flow easily. Capital is simply when you have excess currency, you can build up your capital. You can save it, you can invest it, you can purchase equipment, you can purchase infrastructure type things. You need capital in order to have growth and stability when it comes to your economy. And then energy and resources. Energy and resources are very important because energy drives the system, but it's usually quite expensive, and resources are needed in order to grow and expand your economy. Infrastructure allows your economy to grow just simply beyond subsistence. In other words, I could grow enough for myself and my family, but if I want to start growing for other people, I've got to get a way to get it to you guys. So we need to have transportation, and we need to have communication infrastructure in order to really see our economy grow. And then finally, defense and protection, because a strong economy is always going to be under attack by those who want to consume without actually producing, those who want to take without ever giving. And that's very true of what goes on in our soil, so we have to defend against those entities, and that's going to require investments of capital to do that. So there's real quickly, I boiled down a whole semester of college econ into 5 minutes. I don't know why they couldn't have done that in college. But we're going to look at how these apply to the soil. What do these things have to do with the soil? What's going on there, and why is it important? Well, if you look at the soil as an economy, the way that it functions, it's all based on the sun. It's all based on solar energy, because that's where all of the energy for this economy comes from. But then superimpose on top of that, if we want to look at all the players, there's 3 main players. There's obviously the soil. That's the basis of it. But then there's plants. And then there's also the animals, or the biology. And in this picture, you can see that there's large animals like the cattle and the sheep, but there's also many, many tiny, small animals. And those are the ones that we're going to specifically talk about here this morning. It's going to be the microbiology, the protozoa, the fungus, the bacteria. And we'll look at some of these in particular and the different roles that they play within this economy. So, on the supply side of things, what's going on in the soil from the supply side? Well, as you can see, everybody knows this chemical formula. This is the most important chemical formula in the entire world. This is a very simplified version of photosynthesis. This is what's going on. It's CO2, which people consider a waste product, plus water with the energy of the sun and the chlorophyll that a plant produces, the greenness of the leaf. It will produce glucose, C6H12O6, which is a sugar, and oxygen. So it's taking a waste product and water and turning it into 2 things that are very, very valuable and critical for us to live, and that's the glucose sugars and oxygen. Very simple, but really, when it comes down to it, what you're growing as a farmer, you're really growing this glucose. You're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, you're using solar energy, and you're turning it into glucose sugar that then gets recombined into many different forms, and you're going to be selling some form of that glucose. You're going to be selling some form of that carbon, whether it be corn or beans or beef, or anything else, this is the basis of what's going on. So the plants are supplying carbon. The soil provides nutrients and minerals. If you look over here on the right, there's a whole list of the main elements, the main minerals that a plant needs to grow. The top one is nitrogen. Just forget about that one for right now. We'll talk about that soon. Most of these other nutrients that the plant needs to grow, the soil contains these things. Now, they're not always available, and we'll look at why that is and why that's important, but the soil can provide the nutrients that the plant needs to grow. It also provides a habitat for roots and biology, and it also provides water storage. Very, very important that your soil store as much water as possible, because you guys get probably 10 to 12 inches more rainfall than we do in an average year, but yet there's still periods of dryness. And the more water you can hold in your soil, the better you're able to withstand those drought periods. And it really doesn't matter how much rainfall you get, it really matters how much rainfall you get in the ground and you can hold. So that's two completely different things. So that's what the soil supplies as well. The biology, it provides nutrients through fixation. We'll look at more detail in the nitrogen fixation process, but it's also providing nutrients through cycling and making things more available. And they also provide a great number of services in the defense and protection realm, and we'll look at those later on too. But that's what the biology is bringing to the table. On the demand side, so that was supply. On the demand side, plants need nutrients, plant needs water. We know that, we're farmers, we understand that. But plants also need services like protection and support and these different types of things. Soil has to have carbon. If the soil is lacking in carbon, it's going to go from a nice brownish black color. It'll get lighter and lighter and lighter, and you've probably all seen that on the eroded hillsides. The soil is always a lighter color than it is down in your nice deep fertile bottoms. As soil loses carbon, it changes colors. So soil needs carbon to function properly, but it also needs services. It needs to be protected because the soil cannot protect itself. If you don't keep it covered with something, it will be very susceptible to washing or blowing away. And the biology, these little tiny critters, they're living organisms like you and I. They have basic needs. They need food and they need a place to live. And when you provide those things for them, they will perform an incredible amount of services for you. So in a strong human economy, the best indicator of really good, strong economic growth is when there's very low unemployment rate. Everybody is doing something. Everybody's contributing in some fashion. And it's the same way in the soil. When we get everybody producing the way that they're supposed to, when everybody's producing and consuming, then we have a very strong economy. And again, diversity is very important. We don't want just one or two things. We want multiple things. But here's what happens. And I'm going to preface this by saying that when I say this part of my talk, I'm preaching to myself as much as anybody else. And it does feel like I'm preaching, by the way. But when we externally provide the plant with everything that it needs from the outside, we weaken the economy. And I'm specifically talking about fertility inputs and crop protection inputs. And I liken this to welfare, okay, agricultural welfare, because if you think of this whole thing as an economy, part of any economy is welfare, basically giving handouts. And really what we've done as farmers, us included, and we're still doing this, we're working on welfare reform on our own farm here, but when we externally provide the plant with what it could and should be getting on its own, we're actually giving it a handout. We're weakening the economy. So when we give it fertilizer instead of allowing the natural system to work the way it was created to do, that's welfare. When we're putting these crop protection inputs, we're giving it welfare. Now, Abraham Lincoln is famous for saying you cannot help men permanently by doing for them what they could and should do for themselves. And I really like this quote because notice, he doesn't say we should never help people. He says we can't help them permanently if we continue to do what they could be doing for themselves. And that's kind of the approach that we're taking with our crops. You know, we do need to give some fertility. We do need to give some crop protection inputs. We need to cut back on how much we're doing. Number one, it costs too much. Number two, there's better ways. You know, the native prairies flourished for thousands of years before we ever got here to open up a jug and put something out there for it. The system works the way it was created. You know, God created the system to work very, very well, but when we step in and introduce these welfare type systems, you know, then, well, what happens is when we farm in such a way that ignores the biology, and you'll see later on the role that the biology plays, and most of us do not farm in ways that think about biology first. And when the biology isn't there and working its job, then our crop starts to look yellow. Well, we can't afford to let it look yellow, so we step in and we give it a handout with some fertilizer. It starts to look sick, or we get insects, we get pests. So we step in with these welfare programs to help them out. So we need to figure out how can we wean ourselves off that, how can we allow the system to work the way that God created it to work. And the biggest thing is, and this is one thing that we're doing on our own farm now, when we make farming decisions, when we make agronomic decisions, we ask ourselves, how will this affect the biology? Because for too long, we never asked that question. How will this affect the biology? So yes, we're still putting some fertilizer on. We're trying to cut back. We're trying to change the formulations. We're trying to change the way it's applied, the timing, a lot of things like that, because we ask, how will it affect the biology? Okay, better move on or I'll preach on that all day. Currency. Currency is important because, like I said before, it allows transactions to happen between the producers and the consumers, and it allows it to happen very efficiently. In our soil economy, carbon is the perfect currency. Carbon drives the system because it is the currency that plants will use in order to purchase things. We looked at the photosynthesis, so plants are creating that C6H12O6. They're creating that glucose molecule out of the carbon coming out of the atmosphere, and they're turning it into glucose sugar, and then they will use that carbon. They'll use that carbon and that glucose, and they will purchase things within the economy. So the way it works is the plant produces carbon. It pays for it through root exudates, and I got a really, really cool picture I'll show you later on here that you can actually see the liquid carbon dripping out of the plant roots, and that's how it's making payments to the biology. So it's actually using the carbon to purchase goods and services from the biology through sourcing, delivering, protection. We'll look at how all this works and what these biological organisms are providing. But I've heard experts say that as much as 40 to 60% of all of the carbon that a plant produces through photosynthesis is not used by the plant to grow tissue or to grow new roots or to grow seed. As much as 40 to 60% of all that carbon through photosynthesis is leaked out through its roots in a liquid carbon form, and it's given to, or it's traded, or it's used to purchase things from the biology. Now that's a lot. You know, it's almost like being taxed. It's almost like the government taking 50%, right? But they're getting something in return for it. The plants are not stupid. They are not going to give their carbon away if there's nothing there to give it a return. So if you grow a plant in an environment where there's no biology, the plant is not going to exude all that carbon out. It's only going to do that if it's getting something in return. Plants aren't stupid. You know, they have, you know, they were created in order to not give things away for free. So carbon is so important to this whole system, but yet we often ignore it. Carbon is essential to all life. You know, you and I are 19% carbon. You know, carbon can form over 10 million different compounds. Carbon is the most important but most overlooked of all plant nutrients. When's the last time you sat down with your agronomist or your crop advisor and you said, let's make a carbon plan for our farm this year? It doesn't happen. You know, we talk about nitrogen, we talk about phosphorus, potash, all the trace minerals. We almost never sit down and talk about what does the carbon situation look like. But we know that carbon is the #1 most needed resource for a plant, and mainly because we plant it out of the atmosphere, but we'll show how that's not always enough. And carbon is the main food source for soil biology. So when you start asking yourself that question, how will this affect the biology? Really what you're asking is, do we have enough food out there for all of these organisms that we want living and working for us in our soil? Carbon, when we have increased soil carbon in the soil, it normalizes soil pH. So it takes out some of the negative effects of either low or high pH. We farm a lot of soils that are underneath 5.5, and we don't worry too much about liming because we've been growing good crops. And I think that's partially because our organic matter levels are going up. It increases cation exchange capacity. It increases the availability of all of these important plant nutrients. It reduces the availability of the ones that can be toxic and harmful, like sodium and aluminum. This is all when we have excess carbon in the soil. And look at how carbon is the perfect currency, because you can collect it or earn it through photosynthesis. Plants can spend it when they trade it to soil organisms to purchase these services that they need. You can save it through soil organic matter, and it's desired by all members of the economy. And further, carbon has different states. Just like we have credit and we have cash and we have savings bonds. Well, look, carbon can be in the gaseous form, which is CO2 in the atmosphere. It can be in the liquid form, which is in plants and soils, and it's the liquid form that's moving through the plant and it's being transferred to the biology. That's liquid carbon. And then it's also solid, which is what we're most used to. Like you and I are 19% solid carbon, you know, the plant litter on top of the ground, the residues, that has a lot of solid carbon in it. You know, coal, there's all sorts of solid carbon. We're familiar with that, but it can transfer from one state to the other very easily and very quickly and very efficiently. So carbon is the perfect currency to drive this whole system. But when we don't have enough of it, just like when you don't have enough income, things don't work right, do they? When you start running short on cash, things don't always work the way it's supposed to. And so when you have excess carbon, when you have excess cash, you can start to save, you can start to buy things, you can start to accumulate assets. But if you don't have excess cash or excess carbon, you can't do that. So in the soil system, organic matter is this stored or saved carbon. It's our capital investments. And if you don't know anything else about your soil, the most important thing I think that you can know is my organic matter levels, are they going up or are they going down? Or are they just kind of hanging out about the same? If your organic matter levels aren't going up, it's because you don't have enough carbon in your system. There may be other reasons, but if you don't have enough carbon being generated in your farming system, you will never increase your organic matter level. Just like you will never save money if you spend more than you earn. You have to have excess cash to start a savings account. You have to have excess carbon in order to build soil organic matter. Now, we could talk all day just about the importance of organic matter, the functions of organic matter. We don't have time to do that, but I think everybody understands that it's very, very important. And one of the reasons is because if you think about it as a capital investment, when you look at a capital-rich economy like the United States, we're very rich in capital, very blessed that way. Our economy is productive, it's stable, it's resilient, and it's efficient. And you may not think so, but if you've never traveled overseas and experienced other people's economies or studied other people's economies, you don't really have a good appreciation for what we have here. We have the most productive, stable, resilient, efficient economy in the entire history of the world, partially because of all of our capital resources. High organic matter soils are the same way. We've got some ground that had never really been farmed until we broke it out and have been farming it for the last probably 15 years. And it's been no-till the entire time, and so we've done everything we could to maintain the carbon levels and build them up. So those are 4.5% to 5% organic matter levels, where our other ground, when we started farming it, 1.7 to 2 organic matter. That old sod ground, it always is the most productive. It's always the most stable, most consistent. It's always the last field to show an effect of a drought. It's always the last one to get a disease or have insect pressure because it's so healthy. And it's because the carbon that, it's got double the organic matter that our other farms do. And so, we sit there and look at it and go, man, what would it be like if all of our farms were 4.5%, 5%, 6%? When the pioneers came over to our area, they were probably 8%, 10%. We still lost half of it, even in those areas that haven't been farmed, just because, they were overgrazed or they're improperly hayed. So it's exciting to think about the productivity that we could bring back when we see things like that. But when we can increase the organic matter of our soil, it does so much, even to the water holding capacity. I've heard it said that every % increase in organic matter, you can store an extra inch of water per foot of soil. That's huge. That's huge when you go through a period of dryness. Soil organic matter generates and regulates every ecosystem service that sustains life on Earth. That's a pretty important statement. It's a pretty bold statement. Dr. Lau from Ohio State University said that it's that important that we conserve our organic matter levels. Carbon capital can't be increased without an excess of soil carbon currency, just like we can't increase our savings without having it. And when we're growing, and I don't know for sure what your cash crop rotations here. I can tell you back home, especially on the irrigated ground, almost everybody is corn, soybeans, corn, soybeans. We've got a few guys that are corn. Their rotation is Pioneer corn one year and DeKalb corn the next year. Yeah, it's not really a rotation, but they think it is. But here's the thing, a corn-soybean rotation, you will not increase your soil organic matter because the corn and the soybeans are pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, okay? But we're exporting all that carbon off when we haul the grain away. It's not a net increase in carbon. The plant is producing enough for itself, but it doesn't produce any left over. So think about it like living paycheck to paycheck, okay? Maybe some of you are there right now. We've probably all been there at one time or another in our lives. When you live paycheck to paycheck, you can get by. And maybe from the outside, people don't know how tight things really are. You can get by, but you don't have the ability to withstand any types of disasters. You don't have the ability to withstand tough times very well. Same way with your soil. When you're only growing just cash crops and you're exporting what is produced, it's kind of like living paycheck to paycheck. You're not very resilient. You don't have the ability to withstand a drought or tough conditions. And so you really have to, and that's why cover crops are so important. Okay, I talked this whole time and I haven't even mentioned cover crops yet, but that's why cover crops are so important, because they're the ones that put carbon into the soil, put carbon on top of the soil, and we're not hauling that away. We're leaving it for the soil. And that's why it's such, you cannot have soil health without having cover crops unless you're like in a perennial type system, because they leave things without taking it away. And that's the importance of that. Okay, energy and resources, the next section of the economy that we're going to talk about. Our energy to drive this whole system comes from the sun. We saw that through photosynthesis, and guess what? That energy is free. The government has not found a way to tax the sun yet. That shouldn't give anybody any ideas there. I'm close to DC here. But we have free energy, okay? All we have to do is go out and collect it. And unlike man-made solar panels, our solar collectors are extremely cheap. Buy seed and plant it, and out pop these cool little solar panels, and it will start collecting solar energy that will drive and power the whole system. And a healthy soil economy does not need significant purchased energy inputs. And I can say that not because we don't purchase energy, we purchase a lot, far too much. But I can say that because, again, the native prairies, especially out in our area, there were 8, 10, 12 foot tall grasslands out there that the pioneers write about. Very, very productive economies, and no one was there purchasing energy to make that work. It was all driven by solar energy. And if we were to sit down and go through the financials of any farm here, and we looked at, okay, where are you spending your energy budget? We'd look at, okay, how much diesel fuel, how much natural gas. But the number one energy expense on most farms, nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer is the biggest use of energy on your farm. Now, if you're organic, that may be different, although you may still be surprised how much energy it takes to haul manure and compost and all these things. So I will show you in a little bit why that's such a high energy input into your farming system. But just think of it, how can we eliminate some of these energy inputs? No-till is one way, cover crops is one way, reducing the amount of nitrogen is the second way. So number one resource that our plants need is carbon. We've talked too much about that already, so I'm not going to go into that in any more detail, but I do want to talk about nitrogen, because it's the number one thing that we worry about. It's not the number one thing that the plants need, but a lot of times it's the number one things they're lacking in. And look at this chart. Now, this is kind of an old chart. I need to get a newer one, because the tiny little black line at the top shows the amount, this is a pie chart of our atmosphere. And so the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere right now is somewhere, 0.038, 0.04. It says 0.03 here, but it's probably a little higher than that. But a tiny little sliver of our atmosphere is carbon dioxide, yet a corn crop can pull all the carbon that it needs for that crop out of that tiny little sliver. No problem. That's why we don't generally worry about talking about how much carbon does our plant need. Now, the more residue that we have on the surface of the soil, plants will actually take up CO2 from decomposing residue as well. So if you can have more cover on the ground, you will grow better crops because that plant now is getting CO2 from underneath as it decomposes and releases CO2 as well as from the atmosphere. But we spend billions and billions of dollars on nitrogen, and look at the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere. 77% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, yet we spend billions of dollars to get it. And why is that? Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The nitrogen that's in our atmosphere is held extremely tightly. It's an inactive dinitrogen molecule. You can see a picture here. It's two nitrogen molecules that are bonded together with 3 pairs of covalent bonds. Very, very, very stable. It's inert. Now, the good news is we're not dead, okay? Because if it wasn't held in this form, we would all be dead, and it really wouldn't matter. Because you cannot breathe that much nitrogen and survive. Think about if you've ever gotten a whiff of anhydrous ammonia. Yeah, that's not good. That's active nitrogen. This is inactive. This is inert nitrogen. So the good news is we're not dead. The bad news is just as we breathe in 77% nitrogen and it does not affect our body, plants are taking that same amount of nitrogen in and out when they're getting CO2, and they can do nothing with it. A plant can do nothing with this molecule. This does not react with anything. It goes in, it goes out. That's why we can have all this nitrogen around us in the atmosphere and plants can do absolutely nothing with it. Because the way the system was designed, it has to go through the biology. So what happens is in order to get that nitrogen into a form that can be used, it has to be made plant available or fixed. It's combined with hydrogen and oxygen. It's a very expensive process, and you have big nitrogen producing factories like this. These types of factories were actually made for World War II because nitrogen was the main bomb component. Okay, remember the Oklahoma City bombing of the federal buildings there? What was that bomb made out of? It was ammonium nitrate, fertilizer. Very explosive because once you pull those nitrogen molecules apart, and it's no longer that stable dinitrogen, it's very active, it's very volatile, it's explosive even in some forms, but it's a very energy-intensive process to pull those things apart. So they figured out how to do it back prior to World War II. They used it extensively during World War II to make bomb-making materials. When the war was over, we had all these dual factories. We didn't necessarily need bombs anymore, so they started making commercial fertilizer. So yes, you can buy nitrogen, but the amount of energy that it takes to pull that nitrogen molecule apart and make it in a form that your plant can use takes a lot of energy to do that. But guess what? God created these tiny little bacteria. We can't even see them without a microscope. These tiny little rhizobia bacteria that essentially are doing the exact same thing. They're doing the same thing that that big factory was doing. They're just doing it down at a tiny little micro scale. So if anybody ever tells you that, well, just plant a legume, it can make its own nitrogen. It can't. Plants can do nothing with the nitrogen in the atmosphere. No plant can, but the bacteria can. And the bacteria, there are certain bacteria that will grow on certain legume plants. And what they do is they will actually, you can see on the right-hand side, that little nodule. You've all seen nodules on soybean plants. Those nodules are essentially little micro nitrogen factories. They're taking that dinitrogen molecule out of the atmosphere. Somehow they're able to break that bond. It takes us billions of dollars to do. These tiny little guys will do. They can break that bond. They combine it with oxygen and hydrogen, and they make it into a form that the plant can use. Now, they don't do it for free. They can't do it for free. Because as cool as rhizobia are, and they can pull that nitrogen molecule apart, they cannot feed themselves. They cannot make their own food. They would starve if they weren't getting a paycheck, just like us. You wouldn't do that for free. They don't do it either. They will only do it if the plant is willing to pay them in carbon. Because what they eat that sugar, okay? They're just like a little kid, I guess. But they eat that sugar, they eat that glucose molecule that comes from the plant. And so these things will only grow if the plant's willing to pay them in that currency, which is carbon. And so it's a very, very cool system, and it's a very effective system, and that's how these native prairies, grew, tons and tons of biomass without any additional nitrogen input, because legumes can work with these bacteria to make the nitrogen available to the plants. But it's not just legumes, and it's not just rhizobia. There are other organisms in our soils that can do this as well. Now, there's organisms like Azospirillum, Azotobacters. There are other ones too. They're even harder to pronounce than these two, so I only listed these. But these are not limited to legumes. Like rhizobia could only associate, and they're very closely associated. Like the rhizobia that will work with peas will not work with soybeans. And the ones that work with soybeans will not work with peanuts. Very specific. These guys, they're kind of promiscuous. They don't really care. They will fix nitrogen, whoever's willing to pay for it. Okay, so they can fix nitrogen. They can take it, break it apart, and trade it to the plant in exchange for carbon. Again, they have to get paid. They're not going to do it for free. Otherwise, they would die. So these little guys are cool because now we can do this with grass plants. We can do this with non-legume broadleaf plants. So why in the heck are we putting all of this money into nitrogen fertilizer for our corn? Why don't we just load up on these guys? Well, part of the reason is these guys aren't nearly as effective as rhizobia. If you grow a 70-bushel soybean crop, the rhizobia on that soybean plant probably produce somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds of nitrogen to grow that crop. Soybeans require an incredible amount of nitrogen. They're very high in protein. It comes from nitrogen. So can you imagine trying to grow soybeans if you had to apply 600 pounds of nitrogen? Nobody would do it. You couldn't make any money. But the rhizobia are incredibly productive in producing that much. These guys, they're only going to produce 20 to 40 pounds. Okay, so what's 20 to 40 pounds going to get you for a corn crop? Well, it's not going to be where you're going to want to be. And that's why we see corn turn yellow, even if we have these guys, because corn requires more nitrogen than that. But think about this. What would 20 to 40 pounds of nitrogen do for a forage crop? Or what would it do for a cover crop? Or what would it do for a crop that we're going to graze and the cattle are going to recycle the nutrients back into the system? Well, that's huge. That makes it, if you've ever put a cover crop on and added 40 pounds of nitrogen, you might get twice the growth. A lot of nitrogen is needed for grain production. In a forage-based system, you don't need that. So these things can be very effective in certain parts of your rotation. I'm not saying go out and try to grow your corn without any nitrogen. Okay, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying, though, that we need to look at utilizing these types of organisms. How can we promote these types of organisms, especially with our cover crop? Because if we can produce 40 pounds of nitrogen with these when we have our winter cereal cover crop out there, then that nitrogen, and I'm not hauling that away, I'm not harvesting that winter barley or rye or triticale, it's going to cycle back into the system and just give me a head start for my next corn crop so I can reduce the amount that I have to give the next corn crop. So again, how will my decisions affect the biology? Okay, so these things still must associate, they must trade nitrogen for the carbon. Okay, now there's other mineral resources as well. It's not just carbon and nitrogen. There's other things going on here as well, and we just have to go get them. Our soils contain most of the nutrients that it takes to grow a crop, but they're not available for a plant. Plants cannot access the vast, vast majority of the minerals that are in your soil. They just simply can't. Just like they can't get nitrogen out of the atmosphere, they can't extract the minerals out of the soils, but the biology can. This is a cool picture. This is from a mine in China, and it shows, I don't know if you can see the little strand going from left to right, horizontally across there. That's actually a fungal hyphae that has bored a tunnel through solid rock, and it's extracting iron and magnesium out of that solid rock. Here's another really good picture. This is from Scientific American, and I love the title of this article. It says, Mycorrhizal Fungi run the largest mining operation in the world. Think about that. The largest mining operation in the world is done by things you can't even see without a microscope. But look at the picture on the right. That's a piece of feldspar. Think of it as a tiny little grain of sand, highly magnified. And those tunnels, those channels that you see cut through there are actually voids. They are actually channels cut through there by the mycorrhiza. What they do is they can excrete chemicals. The chemicals will dissolve solid rock. As they dissolve the chemical, the hyphae grows further in and further in and further in, and they can bore holes straight through solid rock. What they're doing is they dissolve the minerals that the rocks are made out of, they liquefy it, they bring it back through the hyphae. Here's a picture of what they look like. These hyphae are actually attached to plant roots, and they will bring those nutrients into the plant roots in exchange for carbon. Because as cool as mycorrhiza are, and they can dissolve solid rock, they cannot produce their own food. They have no ability to photosynthesize. They have no ability to generate anything useful for them to live on. Because you know, fungus can't live on iron and manganese alone. They need carbon. That's their food source. So they can produce this. They trade it. They sell it to the plant in exchange for carbon. So mycorrhiza fungi actually start inside the plant root. Those little black circular things are the arbuscles. Then the hyphae go out, and they go out and explore the soil. The author of this article, Jennifer Fraser, she says, I'll just sum this up because I'm kind of running behind, but these trace elements are often available in the soils, but they're not available to the plants. But basically she's saying, but the mycorrhiza can bring them in and it can make them available to plants. Pretty cool stuff. And then transportation and communication infrastructure are so important because we know that we can cripple an economy if we can disrupt these two forms of infrastructure. And we know that because anytime where there's a war, in the history of war, one of the main things that you would do right away is you would try to disrupt transportation and communication. So you would see countries blowing up bridges, bombing railways, airports, things like that. You know, nowadays, you know, back in the day, they would bomb a telegraph line, telephones. You know, now you would try to target an internet communication center. I mean, think how much our economy would be crippled if all of a sudden the internet went down and you had no internet. It would, you know, I'd have to shut my company down because we are so based on it. You will cripple an economy if you cripple their infrastructure. It's that important. And so as I was thinking about transportation infrastructure, I was thinking about the United States. We've got great transportation infrastructure. Again, it's one of the reasons that we are the most productive economy in the history of the world. Now, you may drive down your roads and think, man, my county roads suck, okay? And we do that too. Everybody does that in their county, I think. But if you look at the country as a whole, we have a very efficient interstate highway system. They're big roads, can transport a lot of goods and services very efficiently, but there's a lot of places that aren't that close to an interstate. So if you look at the highway system overlaid with the interstate system, now there's no large population of people that is very far from a paved road, which gets them to an interstate, and you can transport your goods and services pretty quickly and efficiently across the entire country. And as I was thinking about that map, I was thinking about plants. And the picture on the left is a plant that has no mycorrhiza. It's just the roots. So if you look at those roots and think of them as the interstate system, they're big conduits. You can move a lot of stuff back and forth pretty quickly. You know, plants have the ability to transport nutrients up and down through that. You know, the sugars from photosynthesis go down, the nutrients from the soil go up. It's the interstate. But look, there's so much of the soil that isn't being touched by the interstates. And so you need to overlay the highways, the mycorrhiza, which has colonized this plant on the right. Now it's growing out, it's spreading out, it's created this fungal network. Look how much more of that soil is now being touched. It's being explored, it's being mined, and it's being transported, all those nutrients back up to the plant. And without the mycorrhiza, that plant is not going to be nearly as healthy. Here's another picture of mycorrhiza. mycorrhiza transports all these different things, and mainly phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of the hardest things for plants to access out of the soil. We dump all kinds of phosphorus on our soils, and our plants take a very, very low percentage of what we put out there. Your soils are, and here with all the manure and stuff, you guys may really have high phosphorus soils. Back where we farm, we have to put phosphorus on every year. We don't have access to the chicken manure, and so phosphorus is one of our big inputs. But most soils have the phosphorus in them. It's just that the plants can't get to them. So they show phosphorus deficiencies because the biology isn't there. But if we have these mycorrhiza, they are very efficient at extracting that phosphorus and delivering it to the plant. And look at that, look at the last statement. In dry times, mycorrhiza will even deliver water to the plant. The plant could say, I need water. And the mycorrhiza will go out and find water because it can explore more of the soil than what just the plant roots can. So it makes the plant much more drought tolerant. And so as I was thinking about this whole concept, about 7 or 8 years ago, I went with No Till in the Plains to a trip to Brazil, and we were up in the Mato Grosso region, which is kind of central Brazil there. It's the area of Brazil where they have these huge, 100,000 acre soybean farms, and you see these pictures, where they have 20 or 30 combines out in the field, and they're real. They really do exist. I was there, I saw them. They told us, and I don't think they were lying to us, they told us just in that area of Brazil, just in that one state of Mato Grosso, they have more land they could bring into production, but they haven't. They have more acres than the entire amount of acres that the United States grows currently in corn and soybeans. Over 200 million acres, they're not producing a thing on, but they could. They get 70 inches of rain a year, and they have a 10-month growing season, so they grow 2 crops a year. Why aren't they doing it? Here's why they're not doing it. They've got nothing for infrastructure. And that thing is sitting right in the middle of Brazil, and it's a 3-day trip one way to haul your crop to market. They use very little grain domestically for livestock. Almost all their livestock is grass-fed. They don't feed corn and soybeans to livestock there. They export it. So it all has to go to the coast. They're a long ways from the coast. Infrastructure severely limits what they can do as a farming economy. If they ever get that figured out, you better get ready to figure out how to make $5 soybeans work, because they'll whoop us worse than they are right now. Now, mycorrhiza aren't the only thing that's important for transportation in the soil. Earthworms are critically important. The earthworm channels will help transport water and oxygen, and they move residue around. Other biology can jump on, and they help spread other biology around. If your soil does not have earthworms, it's not very healthy. We learned that ourselves. When I was a kid growing up, if we wanted to, go dig up worms to go fishing, we'd have to go to where the sewer dumped out. That's the only place on the whole farm that had any earthworms. Nowhere else did, because we tilled. Now I could go dig anywhere on the entire farm and find earthworms in just about every spadeful of soil, as long as it's not super dry and hot, and they'll be down deeply. Earthworms are the best indicator that you can visually see of soil health, so kind of monitor your earthworm population. And then communication is very important as well. We talked about transportation, but communication is also occurring, and it's occurring right around the roots. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen the Chicago Board of Trade in action, but it just looks like complete chaos. People yelling and shouting at each other, making hand gestures. But what's really going on is commerce. They're buying and selling. And that's kind of what's going on right around the tips of your plant roots. There's a lot of communication happening. It may look like chaos under the microscope, but plants communicate to the biology what they want. Because remember I told you the mycorrhiza can bring in phosphorus, they can bring in boron, they can bring in water. Well, how do they know what the plant wants? Well, the plant tells them. The plant signals the biology what it needs by exuding different types of carbon compounds. Now, there's all sorts of things coming out from this root that I can't even pronounce. There are different types of carbon compounds, and based on what the plant is leaking out, that's a signal to the biology what the plant is requesting. So it may want manganese, it may want boron, it may want water, it may want phosphorus. And these different compounds are different signals bringing different things. Here's that picture I was telling you about. Look at this. Now this picture was not taken with a high-dollar microscope. This is taken with a $150 pro scope. And if your district doesn't have one of these things, they're really cool. You can buy them on Amazon. They clip right to an iPhone. And for 150 bucks, you can take pictures like this. This is a plant root. This is not mycorrhiza. This is a plant root, and the little things that you see sticking out are root hairs. But the thing that's so cool about this, you see those little droplets on those root hairs? That's actually that liquid carbon that the plant is producing through photosynthesis, and it's leaking out through those root hairs to feed to the biology. The biology will consume that, and then it will deliver the goods, whether it be, you know, the mycorrhiza. There's all the other biology that we didn't have time to talk about. They're all there, and they all need that carbon. This is what's happening. The plant will exude carbohydrates and sugars and proteins and fats and lipids and oils, all of which are carbon-based compounds. Each one of those signals that I need something different. It's extremely complex, far more than what I even could begin to explain, but that's kind of the basis of what's going on. The plants are exuding this liquid carbon, the biology is consuming it and understanding the signal, and it's bringing the appropriate thing. But plants communicate other ways as well. Plants can communicate through the air and through their roots. And again, this is a fascinating topic that I don't either have the expertise or the time to explain in detail. They've done some really cool studies that will show that when a plant is under attack by aphids, its neighboring plants that don't yet have aphids will start ramping up their defenses against aphids, because this plant communicated to this plant over here, there's aphids coming, get ready. And the way it does it in two ways. They've done experiments and they've proven both ways. If you have mycorrhiza that will tie those plant roots together, because the plant roots will actually never grow completely together. They can't communicate through root to root, but they can communicate from root to mycorrhiza to the other root, because one mycorrhiza can be grown into two different roots, and then the plants can communicate through that mycorrhizal network. It can also communicate through volatile chemical compounds, or just think of it as like a perfume. And if you've ever gone out to a crop field, sometimes you can smell very distinctive, you know, odors, you know, and sometimes those plants are signaling other plants if they're under attack, and you can see the little molecules float through the air there. It not only signals other plants, but it's actually calling in an airstrike. Okay, so a ladybug, the predatory wasp, they can pick up that smell of a plant that is putting out this signal that I'm under attack. If you've got the predators there, they'll hone in on that and they'll come and eat the aphid. So it's a call for help. It's also a warning call. Fascinating stuff. There's lots of good stuff on the internet that you can learn about that. There's a whole article in Scientist magazine talking about this. Again, it's super fascinating to know the level of communication that is occurring both above the ground and below the ground when it comes to all of this. And just showing how they communicate with insects as well. Okay, and the last topic was defense and protection, because I told you that the economy always needs to be protected, because even water, you know, we have to have water to grow our crops, but water can also be one of our worst enemies when it comes to erosion. Too much or too little is a bad thing, so we have to protect the soil from water, from wind, from heat, from cold, compaction, weeds, insects. There's all sorts of things that we have to protect our environment from, our crop environment economy. And there's just some simple ways that we can do that. It's much more complex than this. But really, one of the best things you can do is just keep the soil covered. Rolf Derpsch, who is from Paraguay, but was our tour guide when we were in Brazil, he said that almost all of the advantages of a no-till system, he says they're not coming from the fact we're not tilling the soil. He says the majority of those advantages are coming because we're keeping the soil covered, because tillage will destroy residue cover, and he's saying it's more important to keep the soil covered than it is not to till it. It's just hard to keep it covered if we're doing too much tillage. Always aim at full soil cover. When you can keep it covered, you protect it from water erosion, from wind erosion, from being too cold, too hot, from weeds growing, all sorts of things. So the number one thing, keep the soil covered as much as you can. Second line of defense is just simply communication, plants signaling each other, plants signaling insects, plants signaling biology. I talked about that already, but it's a great defensive mechanism that plants have. And by the way, the healthier these plants are, the better able they are to communicate, because this communication is all carbon-based, and if the plant is carbon limited, it's going to limit how much communication they can do. And it also doesn't do the plant any good to signal your ladybugs if there's not a ladybug around for 10 miles. Okay, so you need to think about what you could be doing to keep populations of these beneficial insects close by that can get called in when they're needed. The third line is healthy plants, healthy crops have far fewer needs to be protected. Now you may think, well, that's because we've already protected it. But it's shown, and again, this is a slide from a friend in Texas with NRCS, Willie Durham. He's showing that the pyramid starts at the very basic, just all plants are going to photosynthesize. That's the base level. That glucose sugar, insects love simple glucose sugars. And if that's all a plant is producing, it will have insect infestations all day long, because insects will just hammer the simple sugars. As that plant gets healthier and healthier, it'll turn that glucose into more and more complex compounds within the plant, so you get complete proteins, and then you go to fats, lipids, and oils, and then the secondary metabolites at kind of the highest level. The higher up that pyramid you go, the more complex the molecules are within the plant. And they've got good studies to show that insects cannot digest these complex proteins. They just can't. So when you have a really healthy plant that is producing these complex carbon molecules within the plant, fats, lipids, oils, secondary metabolites, you'll have very little insect pressure, because they can't do anything with that. They need the simple sugars to digest it. So the healthier that we can keep our plants, the less need that they're going to have for being protected. Fourth line is symbiotic relationships between plants and organisms. This is a picture from the Noble Research Institute just showing they're working on novel endophytes. An endophyte is a fungus that will actually infect the roots of a plant. It'll actually live inside the roots, just like mycorrhizal, but it has a different function. The main thing that these types of funguses will do is provide that plant with protection from diseases. So they're experimenting with things like that. And then the fifth line is just simply be diverse. The more diverse you are, the less likely you're going to get attacked or at least destroyed. Because if I have a diverse cover crop growing like this, if an insect or a disease or something comes, what are they going to do? They're going to attack maybe one or two things, but they're certainly not going to wipe me out. And you say, well, yeah, that's great for cover crops. What about cash crops? There's more and more people. In fact, one of the last conferences I went to in Wichita, there were a lot of people there talking about growing 2, 3, 4 crops together, harvesting it, and then figuring out how to separate the seed. Chickpeas, if you can grow chickpeas right now, they're worth about $24 a bushel. And you know why? Because the places that they're growing chickpeas, diseases are destroying them. Chickpeas are very susceptible to diseases, and so they have to move chickpea production out for 6 or 7 years. They're running out of places to grow chickpeas. And guess what? The guys that are growing chickpeas and flax together in the same field are having almost no disease issues, because that disease gets confused when it's not just chickpeas in the field. And so I think if you keep your ears open, you're going to hear more and more people talking about diversity within the cash cropping system, not just within the cover crop system. So kind of exciting things. Okay, so real fast, that was all of those keys to a healthy soil, and I just have 8 real fast takeaway points to summarize this. And I think if you want, there will be copies of this. People can get copies of the presentation. If you want, you can go onto YouTube and see the same presentation. Just go to YouTube and search for Carbonomics. You can watch this again or show it to landlords or friends or whoever, enemies. Maybe you want to show it to your enemies, I don't know. Economies are intricately interconnected and interdependent, and you can't mess with one part of the economy without affecting it all. And that's what we've done as farmers. We've affected biology, and it's affected the rest of the system, and that's why we had to supply so much welfare. So our goal as farmers should be to reduce the amount of welfare that we're giving our system. And again, this comes down to the methods. How you do it on your farm is going to be different than how I do it on my farm. I'm not here to tell you how to do that. I'm telling you that you should. I'm telling you that I should, that Michael should. We all should reduce the amount of welfare that we're giving our economy. We need to get everyone working the way it was created to work. Number 3, increase your cash flow of carbon currency. If you're growing corn and soybeans in a rotation, you're less than 50% efficient at collecting solar energy, turning it into liquid carbon, and building your soil. So you need to add things. You need to add the cover crops. Again, that's why cover crops are so important, because it allows you to capture that free solar energy, capture that free carbon dioxide. Good grief, as farmers, our biggest things we use are free. How come we're not all filthy rich? I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that, but look at all this free stuff we've got. Part of it is we're not taking advantage of the free stuff that we have. Because how many days of the year when something could be growing are we not growing something? That is wasted time. That is a waste. We need to collect it as much as we can, turn it into liquid carbon, and then when we have this excess carbon in the soil, we can turn it into capital investments, organic matter, and then once we get this, once we have this organic matter, don't do these things, because this is selling off your investments. This would be like investing in a Roth IRA and then turning around so you can go on a fancy vacation. You don't make a long-term investment just to sell it off at the first whim. So if you're going to make the investments of organic matter, don't do these sorts of things unnecessarily because that's selling it off. Number 5, take advantage of all these free little workers. They literally work for carbon. They work for carbon, and carbon is free, so we should have as many of these guys working for us as we can. Number 6, build and do not destroy your infrastructure. You'll really see your economy grow. And remember, I told you that when you are at war, you destroy infrastructure. So when you're doing this, you are literally declaring war on your soil. Number 7, protect your economy as soil armor. Keep it covered as much as you can. Number 8, get as much diversity into your system as you can, because it's so very important to be as diverse as you can be. And if you can't do it through your cash cropping rotation, which is okay because it's hard, do it through the cover crops. Driving out here, I saw a lot of good cover cropping going on. I would encourage you to continue that, but to think about what can we add to add more diversity to that system to make it stronger and to make it healthier. So those are your 8 takeaway points. That is, in a nutshell, kind of fast. I know there's a ton of information there, but that's the soil economy. That's all happening under our feet. It's incredibly complex, but it's a beautiful thing. And when we understand it better, the better we understand it, the better we are to able to manage it and make it be profitable for us. So